As a new or returning player, the sheer number of weapon damage talents in the Division 2 can be quite overwhelming. So in this video I'm going to tell you which is the best talent for weapon damage you can put on your weapon. In order to rank the weapon damage talents for weapons in the Division 2, I'm going to rate them on three criteria: the pure increase in weapon damage they deliver, how easy they are to trigger, and the number of weapons they can be used on, as 10 of the talents are specific to only one weapon. But before we start looking at specific talents, did you know that the wording of the talents is incredibly important when deciding which to use, and that one of the most used talents actually delivers a pretty rubbish damage increase? If you look at the talents on weapons, you will notice 7 different types of damage buff. So why is this important? Well, the descriptions tell you how the talent fits into the weapon damage calculation, and more specifically, which damage bucket they fall into. Now, I covered how damage works in this video here, which I will link in the description and at the end of this video. When testing these talents, I've used this build here, which has 4 weapon damage cores and will be at the 60% critical hit chance cap with all weapons. Changing the number of weapon damage cores will change some of the percentage buffs I referred to in this video. Again, check out this video here if you want to understand exactly why. Let's get into the talents in alphabetical order. Behind you is a new talent that was introduced into the game in Year 5 Season 3. It was clearly meant to pair with the chest talent from the Aegis gear set and a decoy, but only left players with the question, why? When the talent flatline delivers the same damage and is far easier to trigger. Behind you is also only usable on rifles and marksman rifles, so while it has a strong amplified damage buff, overall it's not a talent that gets much use, and rightly so. If I was ranking talents for creativity, Boomerang would get top marks. A 50% chance that a critical hit will return ammo and buff your next shot is just so different to every other talent in the game. But is it any good? In simple terms, no. With a 60% critical hit chance build, it effectively only happens 1 in 3 times, and then the damage buff is only applied to the next shot, which might not be a critical hit and will result in very small uplift in damage. On top of that, while the talent says that the damage is increased by 40%, in fact it is only buffing additive weapon damage, so you're only actually getting a much smaller damage increase, roughly 18% when it does trigger. Avoid this talent at all costs. Another new talent for Year 6, this talent has been received with Ray Mixed Fuse, but largely due to all the bugs around it, the talent remaining on even after it's swapped off a weapon or not activating at all, which is surprising given how bug free the Division 2 is. On the face of it, the talent has the potential to deliver Ray strong damage, with each pellet that hits delivering 3% amplified damage to the next shot. With weapons like the Super 90 packing 8 pellets, that is a potential 24% amplified damage buff, making it one of the highest in the game. But there are downsides. This is a shotgun only talent, and beyond 10 meters shotguns are inaccurate, and hitting 6 pellets to activate the talent is a bit hit and miss. It also doesn't address the key issues with shotguns, their long reload times, unlike the talent Pummel. So while Brazen's per shot damage is better, it is neck and neck with Pummel for the best shotgun talent. Overall though, this is a good talent when it works. Breadbasket is not a great talent due to its rather clunky trigger mechanic. The damage buff is reasonable at 105% headshot damage every 4 shots, 26.25% on average, but getting it to work consistently is just not worth it. On paper, Close and Personal is the close range run and gunner's perfect talent, buffing damage with every kill, but it does have some significant downside. For it to trigger, enemies have to be within 7 meters when they are killed, which is going to leave you very exposed to damage all of the time, and that's not for everyone. The 30% buff is to additive weapon damage, and so in reality the uplift is closer to only 14%. The talent can be used on any weapon, but in reality I wouldn't expect to see it used on anything other than an SMG and a shotgun, and for a higher armor run and gun build. For sniper builds, like the one I covered in this video here, Determined is just broken when used in conjunction with the Headhunter talent, letting you chain one-shot kills time after time. To trigger it, you do need to get a headshot kill, and while it can be used with a rifle or a pistol, it is not very effective without certain exotic weapons. So this is a very strong talent, but only in a specific build and with the right gear. Massive definitely had a fixation on weapon swapping at some point, with talents like this one, Versatile, Unwavering, and others, all of which have one feature in common: they are clunky to use, and there are better options. First Blood is not a good talent, giving you one guaranteed headshot per mag, albeit if you miss your shot, you get absolutely nothing. If you are looking for a headshot build run determined, it's better in every respect. Flatline has a lot going for it. It delivers a very good 15% amplified damage and can be used with any weapon. In order to trigger it, all you need to do is pulse an enemy, which can be done with either a scanner pulse or headshots when using the Heartbreaker gear set, or as is most common, using the Link laser pointer from the Technician specialization. This does need a weapon with a long rail, which does exclude some of the favourite weapons in the game like the FAMAS, but there are still many great options. Overall, Flatline is an excellent talent. I like the LMG talent Frenzy. It can deliver a very strong DPS buff with its rate of fire and additive weapon damage buff, but it does have two big issues. Firstly, it is only activated on a reload from empty, and LMGs have some of the slowest reloads in the game. On top of that, it only lasts for 5 seconds, which is not very long at all. Looking at an example of how it would work on a GR9 for example, with 200 rounds in the magazine and an RPM of 787, it takes roughly 15 seconds to fully empty a magazine, and each reload takes a very long 4.2 seconds. Rolling Frenzy onto this, and each time it triggers, we would get a 60% weapon damage and rate of fire buff. The weapon damage buff would increase damage per shot by around 27% with our test build for about the first 105 bullets in every mag, 14% across the entire mag, but when coupled with a 60% higher RPM for the first 5 seconds and allowing for the reload time, overall DPS would increase by a whopping 35%, which is the best damage increase of any talent. But there is one final problem with the talent. LMGs have the highest suppression of any weapon. What this means is that if you start firing at an enemy, they will hide in cover and stay hidden, which if this coincides with when you reload, can leave you with no target to shoot at in the 5 seconds that Frenzy is active. I would love to recommend this talent without reservations, but in the end, it is a very tough one to get the most out of its potential. InSync is not a talent that is often thought of as a weapon damage talent, and that is a big miss because it actually delivers a very solid 30% additive weapon damage buff, a damage uplift of roughly 13.5%. It is also relatively easy to trigger. Just slap on a striker drone or an assault turret and shoot everything in sight. This talent has two limitations. Firstly, that it is only up for 5 seconds at a time, which is not that big an issue given that when you are fighting, you and your skills will be constantly shooting enemies and constantly triggering the buff. And secondly, when your skills are on cooldown, there is no way to trigger the talent at all. But overall, this is actually a much stronger talent than many of the more popular weapon damage talents that are used. Similar to InSync, Killer is not often used mainly because of its trigger, which is killing an enemy with a critical hit. Now you might think that the chance of it triggering would settle down to the critical hit chance for your build, but that isn't correct because critical hits deal significantly more damage. For example, in the test build I've been using, a critical hit deals 149% more damage than a non-critical hit, which significantly increases the likelihood that it will be a critical hit that deals the killing blow. I'll leave it to someone smarter than me though to calculate the exact percentage. And if you are killing enemies quickly with a higher RPM weapon, then even if it doesn't trigger on every kill, there is a good chance that it will trigger again within its 10-second duration. And the buff itself is a strong one. While critical hit damage is additive within the critical hit damage bucket, for the test build this talent still increases average damage per shot by nearly 16% when it triggers. Definitely a talent not to overlook. Measured is one of those talents where it looks interesting, but because of its wording, no one really understands whether it is good or not. So let's peel back the onion and work it out. Rate of fire will have a 1-for-1 impact on DPS, so clearly a 20% increase in the top half of the magazine is good, but it comes with a 30% decrease in weapon damage. Thankfully though, weapon damage is additive, so this isn't a 30% decrease in DPS, but rather just 13.5% with the test build. Overall, the top half of the mag will increase DPS by about 6.5%. Now it would be easy to think that the bottom half of the magazine is just the reverse of the top, but note the wording. While RPM is decreased by 20%, it is total weapon damage, which is multiplicative, that is being buffed by 30%, resulting in an overall increase in DPS of 10%. Combined, the talent will increase damage by around 8.25%, which is on the lower side but with no trigger requirement, making it a solid talent for SMGs, assault rifles and LMGs. While this talent is not as bad as it looks, it is still really bad. There are a number of enemies in the game that have armor plating rather than armor, like the robot dogs, which will trigger this talent in addition to red bar enemies. But do yourself a favour and run determined if you want to run a sniper build. In fact, run anything other than this talent. Optimist is one of the most used weapon damage talents, if not the most used in the game, which is probably not surprising given that it works on every weapon. It's simple as it comes to use. Shoot enemies, and as you fire, your weapon damage increases. But the damage buff is actually not that good, because while the buff scales up to 30%, it is increasing additive weapon damage. For my test build, Optimist delivers a damage buff of only 6.4% with a FAMAS, so easy to use, but bottom tier damage. Probably the most misunderstood weapon damage talent used by new players. For a long time, Pummel was best in slot for shotgun builds, overcoming the very long reload times that they suffer with. The damage buff is to additive weapon damage, but is big enough to still be very meaningful, coming in at around 18% with a Super 90 on my test build. The real challenge when using the talent is that you have to play ultra aggressively in order to get the most out of it, stringing 3 kills every 10 seconds, something which is very situational when enemies are rushing players or you are speed running through content. Still, it's right up there as one of the best shotgun talents with the right playstyle. Unless there is something I'm missing, Pumped Up is one of the worst designed weapon damage talents in the game. It buffs additive weapon damage. It is triggered on reloading a weapon type that typically suffers with longer reload times. It is just awful to use and deals rubbish damage at any sustainable level. Ranger is an overlooked talent that is better than people think, but rarely used because it's not best in slot for anything. With SMGs and shotguns, which are typically used at less than 15 meters, you are only getting a 2 to 4% buff, which is not great. For marksman rifles, which are used at longer ranges, where the damage buff can be in excess of 10% amplified damage, Determined is the go-to talent. And for ARs, LMGs and rifles, which you would expect to get between 6 and 10% amplified damage, better than Optimist, you have Flatline, which delivers a flat 15% amplified damage. Always the bridesmaid, and never the bride. While this talent has the potential to deliver a 50% additive weapon damage buff, its short duration means that in most cases you're going to be building from scratch every time you use it. So it's probably not a mile off to estimate the average damage buff at around twice that of the talent Optimist, say 12.5%. The challenge of course for this talent is that you have to hit headshots. This talent strikes me as one for the purist who wants the challenge of hitting headshots, but for everyone else, there are better options. I'm going to look at these 3 talents together as they work in essentially the same way. These talents deliver an excellent 20% amplified damage buff, one of the best in the games, but the challenge with all of them is the trigger. Typically you'll be using a skill to trigger them, a blinder firefly for Ireless, maybe a fast starter chem launcher for Ignited, or a stinger hive for Sadist, and then the buff will be up, but only while the status effect is still active. And that is why you don't see these used more widely, because unless you have a way to trigger the status effect constantly, they just aren't up for long enough. The exception being Sadist because of the ongoing directive gear set, or Ridge Race Pride, which provide easier ways to trigger and keep the status effect up. Given how clunky grenades are to use, this is not a talent that is used much in general play, but there are specific times when it is best in slot on a secondary weapon. For the final bosses of the incursion for example, where the extra 30% damage to armor enables the team to burn the bosses down quickly. But for new players, this is a talent to avoid. Strained is another of the most used weapon damage talents in the game, which is probably not surprising given that it works on every weapon and is as simple as it comes to use. The damage buff will be dependent on the critical hit chance of the build, the size of the mag, and the RPM of your weapon. The longer it takes to empty the mag, the higher the buff. For my test build, Strain will deliver a damage buff of nearly 10% with a FAMAS, but for every 10% your critical hit chance reduces, or your RPM increases by 150, or 7 less bullets in your mag, the damage buff will reduce by about 1%. Overall though, a very solid talent. The stability and accuracy of most LMGs is pretty shocking, so a talent that makes them even worse is only going to be worth it if the damage buff is top tier. Well, sadly Unhinged only buffs additive weapon damage by 18%, a roughly 8% uplift in damage output for my death build, which is just not worth it. Another talent that leaves me scratching my head over what massive we're thinking. The last talent I'm going to look at is Vindictive, which runs into the same sort of trigger issues as Sadist, Ignited or Eyeless, as it needs a stasis effect to be applied in order for it to trigger. However, with a 20-second duration, it is definitely much better than those talents, and the buff it provides is good, coming in at about a 12% damage increase for my test build, and it also buffs your team's damage, making it a very solid all-round talent. So those are all the talents. But there are 3 talents that have risen to the top of my rankings: Killer, Flatline and Strained. These talents do have one key trait in common: they deliver multiplicative damage through either amplified damage or critical hit damage. But if I was to select one of these as the best, then it would have to be Flatline. It delivers consistent amplified damage for any weapon type and is easily triggered when using the linked laser pointer. And because it is amplified damage, your choice of chest or backpack talent doesn't impact on it, so you can pick the best of each by watching these videos here.